Welcome to the Folktale Project. This is Dan Scholes. This week we're reading stories from the Topaz Storybook. They're stories and legends of autumn, Halloween, and Thanksgiving compiled by Ada and Eleanor Skinner. And this story, it's an adorable tale of a dinner party in the forest with some woodland creatures. This is Mrs. Bunny's Dinner Party. "Are you ready, my dear?" said Mr. Bobtail, looking at his large watch. "Mrs. Bunny will expect us to come in good time to her dinner party."
"I shall be ready in a few minutes, Mr. Bobtail. I wonder how many are invited. We always meet fine people at Mrs. Bunny's house."
Mrs. Bobtail brought out her little gray silk bonnet and Mr. Bobtail's best birch cane.
"Come," she said. "It's a good half-hour's walk to Bramble Hollow. Shall we go around by the way of Cabbage Patch Lane?"
"Oh, no, my dear. Let's take a short-cut through the meadow." Off they started, arm in arm, across the sunlit fields. "See, there are Mr. and Mrs. Frisk gathering nuts," said Mr. Bobtail. "Jack Frost shook the trees last night. There are plenty lying on the ground."
"Good morning. How are all the little Friskies?"
called Mrs. Bobtail.
"Oh, how do you do? They are quite well, thank you,"
said Mrs. Frisk. "The nuts are fine this fall, Mr. Frisk," said Mr. Bobtail, shaking hands with his friend.
"Yes, indeed. We have gathered a great many for our winter store, but, you see, we dare not stop long in this open field."
Mr. Frisk dropped his voice and glanced about in all directions. Then he added,
"This is hunting season, you know."
"What? Do you mean you are afraid of hunters?" asked Mr. Bobtail in surprise.
"Indeed we are," said Mrs. Frisk, coming a little nearer. "From our cozy home up in the hollow of this tree we saw 2 hunters crossing this field this morning. When their dogs sniffed about the ground and barked up the tree, we held our breath in fear. Yes," added Mr. Frisk, "and in a short time we heard bang, bang. I tell you, we didn't venture down to gather nuts for several hours." "How dreadful! And we are on our way to Mrs. Bunny's dinner party," said Mrs. Bobtail, looking in all directions. "Do you think we had better go on, my dear?"
Of course. I've never had the least fear of a gun. Let hunters bang away as much as they please, they will never frighten me." Mr. Bobtail straightened up as he spoke, and tossed back his head. "Come, Mrs. Bobtail. Good day, my friends."
"Good day. We hope you'll have a pleasant time," said
Mr. Frisk.
"Isn't Mr. Bobtail wonderfully brave?"
said Mrs. Frisk, looking after her friends. When they came near Bramble Hollow, Mr. and Mrs. Bobtail met some of their friends. There were Mr. and Mrs. Pinkeye, Mr. and Mrs. Longears, Mr. and Mrs. Cottontail, all on their way to the dinner party. Mr. and Mrs. Bunny were waiting for their guests. The little bunnies had been told how to behave.
"Now, my dears," their mother had said, "you may play out of doors while we are at dinner. When we have finished, I'll call you. Now, no matter how hungry you are, don't dare peep in at the windows. And if anything happens to frighten you, slip into the kitchen and wait there quietly until I come."
Away scampered 4 happy little bunnies. At noon, all the guests had reached Bramble Hollow. Mr. and Mrs. Bunny welcomed them, and in a little while all were seated around the table, laughing and talking merrily.
"What fine salad this is, Mrs. Bunny," said Mrs. Longears. "The cabbage hearts are very sweet this fall."
Mrs. Bunny nodded pleasantly and said,
"Do have some lettuce, Mr. Bobtail. I'm sure your long walk must have made you hungry."
"I hope you will like our carrots," said Mr. Bunny, helping himself to another. "Come, Mrs. Cottontail, let me help you to another serving of turnip tops."
"Thank you, Mr. Bunny. What a pleasant home you have here in Bramble Hollow. Do hunters ever wander into this quiet corner?"
"Why, yes, they stroll through the hollow sometimes."
"Dear me," said Mrs. Cottontail. "Our friends, Mr. and Mrs. Frisk, were telling us that they saw 2 hunters crossing the fields this morning,"
said Mrs. Bobtail. "This morning?" cried some of the guests, pricking up their ears. Come, my friends," said Mr. Bobtail, laughing. "I see I shall have to quiet you. I never could see why so many rabbits are afraid of a gun. I have often stayed quietly under a hedge while a hunter fired shots as near to me as bang, bang, bang. 4 little bunnies leaped through the window and jumped right over the table, upsetting many of the dishes. Mr. Bobtail darted off his chair at the same time and rushed to a corner of the kitchen where he stayed shaking with fear. The other guests did not move or speak for several minutes. Then Mrs. Bunny caught sight of Mr. Bobtail in the corner.
"Come out, Mr. Bobtail," she called. "I'm sure the hunters have gone into the next field."
That is Mrs. Bunny's Dinner Party, a story about a dinner party held by Mr. and Mrs. Bunny for all of the other rabbits in the neighborhood, and the story of the incredibly brave but incredibly cowardly Mr. Bobtail. This is Dan Scholes for the Folktale Project. Don't forget that you can subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Google Play, Overcast, anywhere you like to get your podcasts. You can follow us on Twitter at Folktale Project. You can find us on Auto Radio, TuneIn Radio, Spotify, anywhere you like to listen. And you can always head over to folktaleproject.com, where you'll find a new story waiting for you every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. As always, thank you so much for listening.